Okay, so good afternoon, everyone. My name is John Gutierrez. I am the director at the Center for Latin American, Caribbean, and Latino Studies here at the CUNY Graduate Center. I'm delighted to welcome you to a presentation tonight by our colleague, John Gronbeck-Tedesco. Today's talk, Operation Pedro Pan, Childhood in the US-Cuban Cold War, is built off of John's most recent book, which you can see here, entitled Operation Pedro Pan, The Migration of Unaccompanied Children from Castro's Cuba, published by Potomac Books. We here at the Graduate Center, and specifically at the Center for Latin American, Caribbean, and Latino Studies, are very happy to welcome John as he presents his research. As many of you know, the Clackles is the meeting ground for Latin American, Caribbean, and Latino studies here at the CUNY Graduate Center. We do these sorts of events all throughout the academic year, and we're always very happy to welcome colleagues from outside of CUNY who are presenting work that we find interesting and compelling, and that's certainly the case for John and his work on the Pedro Pan program. John is an associate professor of American Studies at Ramapo College in New Jersey, in the wonderful state of New Jersey, my home state. He is the author of Cuba, the United States, and the Cultures of the Transnational Left, 1930 to 1975, from Cambridge, and of course, most recently, Operation Pedro Pan, The Migration of Unaccompanied Children from Castro's Cuba, published by Potomac Books. His writing has appeared in the American Quarterly, the Journal of Latin American Studies, as well as Slate, the Washington Post, Talking Points Memo, and other outlets. He lives here in New York City, and we are delighted to have him here to talk to us about his most recent project, and a project that means a great deal to a number of us here at the Graduate Center. Before I go, I wanted to say a quick word of thanks to our staff at the Graduate Center, at the Clackles, Andreina Torres Angarita, who has been essential in putting together this event, and Lidia Hernandez Tapia, who, as co-director of the Cuban Studies group here at the Graduate Center, has been essential in spreading the word about tonight's talk. Without any further delay, John, the mic is yours. Thanks.
Thank you for that gracious introduction. And thank you to the Graduate Center and Clackles for allowing me to share what's been the culmination of the better part of 7 years of work, off and on, but something that's occupied my time and my intellectual attention for several years. What I wanted to do this evening is to begin just by reading just a little bit from the book, to give you a sense of this history and the frameworks that I use in analyzing it. And then I'd like to present some slides with some of the images that I've gotten from my research. At the outset, it was a modest proposal: transfer 200 unaccompanied Cuban children to Miami to save them from communism. The time apart from their parents would be short, only until Fidel Castro fell from power by the result of US forced Cuban counter-revolutionary tactics, or a combination of both. Families would reunite in a matter of months. A plan was hashed and it worked. But soon it ballooned into something unwieldy, so that within 2 years, the modest proposal erupted into the largest migration of unaccompanied minors to the United States to date. Mercedes Diaz-Dash remembers the day her parents prepared her exit. Living in the posh Havana neighborhood, Marianao, her father was an accounting professor and her mother a homemaker. Fearful of losing their children to communism, they secured visa waivers and sent Mercedes, her sister, and her cousin, 9, 11, and 5 years old, respectively, on a Pan American Airways flight filled with children scattered throughout the cabin. It was January 25th, 1962. In her home today, several papers, photographs, and mementos document that time, including the doll her parents gave her the day before she boarded the plane. Common in the days leading up to all the children's departure was a sudden increase of activity in the household. With little to no warning, neighbors and family members would scurry in and out, and there was an unexpected gravity to the situation. Children learned that they would be traveling to the United States to attend school for a short time. Many were told that they had earned a special scholarship. When the day arrived, they went to the Havana airport and saw their parents for the last time in months, sometimes years, and in some rare cases, forever. Such a memory will forever be seared into Jose Azel's consciousness. In Cuba, he was a student at a Marist Brothers school and lived an upper middle class life. When Fidel Castro took over Cuba and set his sights on the Catholic Church, the precocious child found himself in the ranks of the underground opposition, engaging in acts of sabotage. The Marists were known for their political militancy. When Castro closed private schools, Jose's father became more worried. Surely the trip would be brief, he thought. Staying behind to take care of the family's possessions, he sent his 13-year-old boy to West Palm Beach in June 1961 on a cargo ship chock full of seminarians. That would be the last time they saw each other. One of the things Jose regrets most today is that he and his father never had an adult conversation. Thousands of such stories have occurred in uneven, conflicted ways told by participants of the Unaccompanied Cuban Refugee Children's Program. The project known as Operation Pedro Pan, which existed between 1960 and 1962, was the coordinated effort to relocate and care for over 14,000 children in the United States between 1960 and 1981. The program relied on a vast network of federal and state offices, the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare, the US State Department, and the Florida State Department of Public Welfare, just to name a few. A long list of nonprofit church groups, child welfare agencies, and airlines aided and abetted the cause, as did embassies, parochial schools, and a solid counter-revolutionary network in Cuba. Children without immediate family support in the United States, more than half of the Pedro Pans, received group and foster care through the Catholic Welfare Bureau and other religious, governmental, and non-governmental organizations, as the young Cubans were dispersed throughout the country. By 1968, more than 8,300 Cuban children had received assistance. Of these children, the Catholic Church had assumed responsibility for 7,346 of them. In our own era, we stand witness to a constant flow of unaccompanied children at the US border, fleeing primarily Honduras, Guatemala, Mexico, and El Salvador. Those countries indeed have changed in just the 2 years since I wrote that. It changes every week, it seems. They are sent by their families or are separated from them in the crossing, in desperate search of refuge from violence and a newfound economic opportunity. In 2014, President Barack Obama's administration had to contend with 68,000 unaccompanied minors attempting to enter the United States. Donald Trump's administration, in an effort to promote zero tolerance, made child separation a strong feature of the border crisis. In 2019, Customs and Border Protection Commissioner Kevin McAleenan called the migrant swell a breaking point. But more children have arrived, with reports of 19,000 accompanied minors crossing in March 2021 alone. By year's end, the United States would count an unprecedented 122,000 children in shelters separated from their parents. That's in 2021. But in 1960 was another reality. Cuban refugee children were thought about in a very different way, with their reasons for coming and their manner of arrival being distinct from those in the headlines today. Parents willfully put their most prized possessions on planes to Miami. The US government aided these ventures and aggressively extended federal resources to reunify the families. Similar today, however, throngs of Americans decreed the incoming waves of Cubans. Were there communists in their masses? Taxpayers shoulder the hefty financial burden. Yet topping these critical voices was an overall willingness to both to accept the children in the name of national security and to make good on America's long storied tradition of offering sanctuary and freedom. The Cold War made such realities seem reasonable. After the triumph of the Cuban Revolution in 1959, Cubans of a particular station became gripped with fear of what Fidel Castro was doing to their country. So strong was this panic that one family sent 8 children to Miami. They belonged to the larger wave of refugees landing on US shores between 1959 and 1962. That number is roughly 250,000 that came in those 3 years. to all of the United States, not just South Florida, but the country as a whole. Operation Pedro Pan flourished among the changes in religion, familial well-being, and racial identity that were transforming the US. The Cold War boiled down to a simplified contest. A line in the sand neatly divided the world between the Soviet sphere of influence and America's. In a matter of months, Castro's Cuba stood as a proxy of the Red Menace, a mere 90 miles from US shores, and its status disrupted not only the longstanding ties between Havana and Washington, but also destabilized the hemispheric neighborhood that the United States had dominated since the Monroe Doctrine of 1823. In the West, during the Cold War, saving the world from communism was of utmost importance in the battle for hearts and minds. Children became symbols with political import tied to strong religious commitments to refugees. Some Pedro Pans were taken in by Protestant, Jewish, and secular organizations. But above all, the Catholic Church made up the nucleus of the Cuban Children's Program. At its helm was Father Brian Walsh, an Irish priest who had recently relocated to Miami and embraced his mission with gusto. He labored at a time when Catholic laity found new life and prestige in post-war America with the election of the first Catholic president, John F. Kennedy. The children's program nearly consumed Walsh, but the young priest was bent on growing Miami's Catholic community. Together, the church and the Cubans did just that. When Walsh lit out for Miami in 1958, the city glistened as a newly minted diocese. It did not become a diocese until 1958. Miami's Catholic community was part of the St. Augustine Diocese. So lots of things were changing in the late 50s in the Catholic Church in Miami. A decade later, 1968, it would boast its own archdiocese. Father Walsh quickly ascended the ranks of the church, becoming a Monsignor in 1962. When poring over his robust archive, one sees a storied career of religious leadership laden with relentless humanitarian involvement. He worked at a breathtaking pace through a variety of demands, but nothing occupied his attention in his 42-year career as much as the children's program. He later conceded, "I conceived of my job of helping Cuban refugees, and in particular Cuban children, as an opportunity given to me by divine providence to combat communism." Walsh saw his role in terms of battle, what he called, and this is his words, a holy war for God and country. He was not alone. His work depended on dozens of Catholic centers in nearly every state to secure temporary care for Cuban young people in foster families and group homes. In a moment when Cuban authorities were isolating and banishing Catholic leaders, the church in the United States opened its doors to them. Walsh's success also entailed a special partnership with the government and nonprofit organizations working to save Cubans from communism. The unique collaboration effectively dissolved the First Amendment's division between church and state in favor of humanitarianism and national security. In its day, the Cuban migration was the largest single nation refugee crisis the United States had confronted. Facilitated by federal, state, and municipal institutions and incalculable heavy lifting by everyday residents, it became a national first and an elevated test for US democracy. The goal was to absorb exiles escaping political and religious persecution, communism, and godlessness, which were among the country's fiercest anxieties in the Cold War. Their religious dedication and fear of losing their way of life prompted Cuban parents to make the agonizing decision to send their children away. They were terrified of communist indoctrination and baseless rumors that the Cuban state would dispossess them of their parental rights. When the children arrived, they found in America in the throes of the most consequential movement in the 20th century, the struggle for civil rights. As the country's abysmal record on racism reached a violent reckoning, Cuban kids were ensnared in these tectonic forces. Because they were anti-communist heroes, mostly light-skinned and to a large degree from middle and upper-class backgrounds, they benefited from an exceptional refugee status that permitted faster avenues towards gaining residency and eventual US citizenship. Yet Cubans were also marked as outsiders who did not fit within traditional racial understandings in Miami and other US communities. People who for the most part were neither Black nor white, but inhabitants in the United States of a new racial space that slipped in and out of these established demarcations. So for instance, there were segregated schools in Miami and Cuban children could go to white schools. But one Pedro Pan, Professor Carlos Ayer, remembers distinctly being told to go to the back of the bus when he arrived to Miami. Red is non-white. In this light, then, Pedro Pan children suddenly embodied two polarizing extremes. On the one hand, they were champion tokens of a militant anti-communism, while on the other, they represented controversial non-white exiles threatening the white majority nation, living on a kind of new hyphen, alchemizing aspects of both Cubanidad, Cubanness, and US Americanness. They negotiated identities that could not be separated from their value as political symbols. The production of Cuban America required the enlistment of US residents to accept refugees and shelter unaccompanied children. The task required ample effort to strengthen the nation's image as a bastion of multiculturalism at a time when evidence of brutal violence directed at the civil rights movement appeared in print and on screens around the world. This visible violence undermined Washington's credibility as the foremost authority of liberty and equality, as Cuban children were scattered throughout the United States, Dubuque, Iowa, San Antonio, Texas, Helena, Montana. With them came the mandate to assimilate them in the name of an enlightened anti-racist democracy. And so now I'd like to show some images. I think that gives you a good schematic of the kinds of conversations I try to enter into in this book. It's about this story, Operation Pedro Pan, which incidentally began as a kind of, it was meant to be a kind of quiet event. Monsignor Walsh, Father Walsh, told this story frequently, that it began in late 1960 with two children, Cuban children, that came to him at the Catholic Welfare Bureau, and they were unaccompanied. And so he got moving towards what would become Operation Pedro Pan. It was never officially called that. That was a name that was dubbed by journalists, and it sort of stuck. But you won't find, files, or at least I haven't, sort of called Operation Pedro Pan anything official. Its more official name was the Unaccompanied Cuban Refugee Children's Program, or for short, the Cuban Children's Program. Pedro is Peter in Spanish, and it's thought that this was Pedro and Peter Pan was sort of the name given for the tale about a boy who could fly. And so that sort of took and stuck, and that's how we got Operation Pedro Pan. But the Cuban Children's Program was something that actually lasted, as I said, until 1981. There were children in care from different generations, all the way till the Mariel boat lift. Although Operation Pedro Pan is usually denoted as the time between 1960 and 1962, when the majority of these more than 14,000 kids came. So, the most immediate, let's see if this is going to work here. Yeah, just had to click on the screen.
Is the clicker working?
Let's see. Now it is. Now it is. Thank you. So the immediate impetus, of course, for this story is the Cuban Revolution. And when Fidel Castro comes into power in January 1959, there is an incredible, in a sort of short amount of time, incredible changes that take place across the island. And so one of the things that takes place is that Castro in 1961 closes the school system, parochial schools, private schools, all schools actually, in order to re-engineer the curriculum to kind of fit a revolutionary vision. And so a lot of parents actually learned about this program through their children's schools. As those schools were closing, the various leaders of those schools, and particularly in Catholic schools, helped parents acquire a visa waiver for their children. Walsh was able to get permission from the US State Department to issue visa waivers, kind of a carte blanche, to young people. Originally, the idea was Cuban kids would come as students. they would be processed as international students getting F1 visas. But that didn't have time to really take shape because the US Embassy in Cuba closes in January of 1961. So the backup plan is the visa waiver. And so parents are able to obtain these visa waivers, some of them legitimate, some of them counterfeit, and put their children on airplanes. And Pan Am and KLM routinely left seats vacant for children. And so there was a way to do this. And then kids were sent to Miami either directly from Havana or through a third country such as Jamaica. So there was even people in Cuba who were, and Father Walsh, who was connecting with authorities in Jamaica, still under British rule at that time, to be able to facilitate travel through Jamaica to get to Miami. If children had contacts in Miami, had family members or vetted caregivers, they could be collected at the airport. But as I mentioned, roughly 8,000 or so needed transitional care. And that's what kind of happens over the course of Cuba moving into this kind of Cold War paradigm with the United States. Once the Bay of Pigs happens in 1961 and Castro is victorious, he's able to consolidate, right, the revolution, and he's enormously popular in Cuba after that. Kind of defeats the United States, and his profile goes up, and the revolution seems to be a more permanent thing. After the missile crisis, airspace closes between the United States and Cuba. So now parents who thought, right, they were sending their kids to the United States for a matter of weeks, maybe a matter of months, now a new reality sets in. Right now, children who were just to be in Miami for a few weeks or a few months are kind of more permanently cut off from their parents. And the other thing that happens is parents believe that their kids were going to stay in Miami. One of the things that happens once this new reality sets in, that the US wasn't just going to free Cuba of Fidel Castro, that Castro was an entity that was going to be more durable and stay longer. The US begins to more aggressively resettle Cubans outside of South Florida. The initial idea was the US would put all these refugees in South Florida, keep them there, and after Castro is defeated or leaves or whatever, we'll just put all these folks back in Cuba. That doesn't happen. And so now Cuban refugees, unaccompanied children included, begin to be resettled outside of South Florida in order to more properly Americanize them. So now Cuban parents don't always know exactly where their kids have ended up. They don't know where Montana is. They didn't understand that their kids would end up in Los Angeles or Dubuque, Iowa. And so things that began sort of in a, what on paper looked to be a kind of controlled short process ended up unraveling pretty quickly. So you've got, some images here from Time Magazine, 1960. You can see that Fidel Castro here is made into like this sort of, there's an infantilization that's happening. He's kind of like a little adult running alongside Nikita Khrushchev and this fictitious baseball team, the East Side Rockets, and now Castro and Cuba are squarely in this kind of communist camp. The Daily Mail in London published this cartoon during the Cuban Missile Crisis. You have John F. Kennedy and Nikita Khrushchev arm wrestling, of course, sitting on top of hydrogen bombs. And so, this certainly changed the course of Pedro Pan and Cuban refugees coming to the United States more broadly. Now, after 62, parents, after the missile crisis, parents wanting to rejoin their kids in the United States often had to go through like Mexico or Spain, which lengthened the journey. But it was much more, if not impossible, to go directly from Cuba to the United States after the missile crisis. This would change in 1965 when Lyndon Johnson and Fidel Castro agreed on opening airspace once again and doing a series of what were called freedom flights, which shuttled Cubans to the United States. And priority was given for parents rejoining their kids. But it was, lots of children had to wait till 1965, and there were a portion of children who didn't see both parents. Sometimes they rejoined with one parent, but not both parents again, or for many years. So, when Cubans come, there is like a lot of news on this, obviously locally in Miami and South Florida, but around the United States. And, Cuban children and Cuban refugees more broadly is kind of a cause that is taken up by America. Miami gets the spotlight, gets the attention of the nation as a place where American democracy, America's history of sanctuary, has to really come up and embrace these Cubans that are fleeing communism, children included. There's a lot of kind of literature and programs that show this, like this is a television program out of Jacksonville, I believe, from the day, the Cuban confusion, right? What to make of these new Cuban exiles coming to the United States. And as I said, there was an ambivalence. Lots of Americans sort of took this as a Cold War imperative, something that the country needed to do. But for others, Cubans were made into a kind of new, quote unquote problem, not unlike Puerto Ricans in New York City, right? There's an anxiety, a racial anxiety about, Cubans coming into American communities and what that might mean. Children are among these masses of Cubans coming to the US, and children who did not have immediate care were put in transitional shelters in Miami, and they were divided by gender, by age, and from there, they could sometimes parents would be able to come or caregivers came, and they only spent a few months in these transitional shelters. But for others, they were then taken to other places around the country. And the Catholic Church had a lot of group homes, orphanages, but they also put kids with foster families. So one of the interesting things about this story when it was happening in the Cold War is that child welfare was also changing enormously in the United States. There was a shift, for example, from using group homes or orphanages as a way to take care of children to foster families. The idea that kids are better with proper and real families. And so all of this is kind of affecting how the country takes care of these kids. They are also, Cuban refugees, sort of more broadly, move from, as I mentioned before, being conceived of as temporary residents to more permanent residents, right? And so they are, and you get these kind of vignettes, Cuban refugees enjoy snow, did they? I mean, some certainly, but the Cubans that I talked to who ended up in Montana, that's the first, this is like indelible memory, I was 8 years old. We took 5 flights and I landed in Montana and there were 6 feet of snow. I'd only known beaches before that. It was absolutely, the snow is one of those big impressions that people got. The Cuban Refugee Center, which was in Miami, was federally funded and was responsible for the processing of Cubans that went through Miami. And again, Cubans went to various places, but the majority went through Miami. Once you got there and were processed by the center, you received like a little blue refugee card, and you were able to get federal assistance. You were able to get food, education, and you were getting a variety of things needed to adjust to the United States. So the Cuban Refugee Program published a monthly kind of periodical called Resettlement Recap that would kind of, again, show these kinds of vignettes of the successful absorption and transition of Cubans to the United States. It's kind of like a public relations sort of endeavor. Well, one of the things that's also interesting about Pedro Pan in the Cold War is that the idea of family well-being, and in particular childhood, increases in visibility in the kind of Cold War vitriol between East and West, the Soviet Union and the United States. One of the things that happens is that there is this, increased concern with a kind of nuclear family, right? This sort of Leave It to Beaver, nuclear family with a husband, wife, and children. This idealized consumer, middle class, property owning. When you look at the public images, more often than not white, sort of American household that is able to, is free because it's able to consume. If you go back to 1959, some of you will know this history. Then Vice President Richard Nixon famously went to Moscow and had a series of talks, debates with Nikita Khrushchev, the Soviet premier. And one of the things they did was try to compare modernity, right? Compare technology and modernity between the Soviet Union and the United States. And in what historians call the kitchen debate was an exhibit, right, of these kind of model homes in the Soviet Union and the United States. And here you see a picture of Khrushchev and Nixon seeing, this kind of exhibit where Nixon is arguing that Americans are freer and American women are freer because of all these technological advances that we have in our homes. And what's so interesting about this image and the way it's cropped, of course, in our days, it looks like this woman is kind of in a prison, right? She's got like these gates and there's almost all men who are watching, telling each other why she's free. It's a kind of irony. But in 1959, from an American perspective, that was the idea. In Cuba adopted a kind of, very quickly, a kind of socialist discourse that also centered on the family. That said that the revolution and the new social will take care of children and families better than the capitalist United States. So throughout Cuban media is attention to children and women and others, and state-run daycare and the state taking care of kids in a way that pre-revolutionary Cuba could not, certainly in a way the United States could not. So you see like examples of los círculos infantiles. These are daycares, and we will create a happy childhood is kind of this motto. And you see, a Cuban woman taking care of a child. And the argument is now Cuban parents, women included, can go to school, get vocational training. They can also work for the state, serve the state. So there's these kind of like competing images of proper womanhood and proper motherhood and family well-being. In the United States, the success of the family and the woman is measured by the woman not having to go outside the home, right? Not having all of these kinds of conveniences at home. Whereas in Cuba, the successful mother/woman is one who's able to take care of the family at home, yes, but also outside and serve the new socialist state. So, Cuban children are kind of then used in this diplomatic vitriol. And, Cuba had a position because it's losing a lot of citizens. And, the question always comes up, well, did Cuba know that parents were sending their children? And the answer almost certainly is yes, but they didn't do anything about it, because to do something about it, to prevent parents from sending their children to the United States would then validate the rumor that the Cuban government is taking rights away from Cuban parents. And so they let parents go, the kids go. But at the same time, Cuba had to issue this kind of public relations move and really focus on the family to convince, to try to stem the flow of refugees leaving and try to make the argument that your family is better off in revolutionary Cuba than it will be in the capitalist United States. One of the other things that's happening, as I mentioned in that brief introduction, is that the Catholic Church is changing enormously in the United States and in Cuba. Arguably, post-war America is a time when Catholics are enjoying the most prestige that they've ever enjoyed in the national frame in the nation's history at that time. If you look at, the 19th century, for example, anti-Catholic politics was very common and very prevalent. After World War II, with the growth of suburbia, you have a lot of second and third generation Catholic immigrants, right? Children and grandchildren of Catholic immigrants who are now going to the suburbs and creating the suburbs, and with them is going a sense of Catholicism. And so in the US, the election of John F. Kennedy in 1960, Catholicism is growing. And as I mentioned, in Miami is becoming a diocese. And now, all these Cubans are showing up, which gives the Catholic Church an opportunity, right, to grow in its visibility, to grow income, and to grow its reach. Conversely, in Cuba, Castro has a decision. When he comes into power in January of 1959, initially, he is looking to play nice with the Catholic Church, right? He even compares the revolution to a kind of Catholicism, a kind of Christian humanism. There's not that much different between what the Catholic Church is trying to do and what the revolution is trying to do. But the Catholic Church is in a difficult spot because since the 1930s, at least, the Vatican had been anti-communist. And so as Castro is moving towards Moscow and the revolution is moving towards a kind of socialism, the Catholic Church in Cuba says in no uncertain terms, you have to choose Rome or Moscow. And many Catholic leaders, clergy, choose Rome. And so Castro then confronts the Catholic Church and makes the argument that the Catholic Church is anti-revolutionary, against the precepts of the revolution, and is a threat. And so Cuban clergy begin leaving in exile, and Castro is able to do this because a lot of the clergy at that time were still Spanish in nationality. So Castro is able to make the argument that this is just another sort of vestige of colonialism. So kicking out these Catholic leaders is kicking out, the Spanish that we defeated in the 1890s. In the United States, by contrast, this is an opportunity. Right? So you have this kind of Catholic wedge that brings something new to what's happening with children. The educational reform also is I think the big trigger. So here you have a piece of anti-Castro propaganda, probably from Miami, that says destruction of the Cuban private school, with the kind of hammer and sickle, showing that the destruction of school is like this kind of communist move. When those schools close for what's called the Year of Education in 1961, a lot of parents who are part of Pedro Pan end up securing the visa waivers and sending their children. There's also rumors that are floating around the island that Castro is going to dispossess parents of their children and send them to Moscow. And so when the revolution enters those the home, right, and is now entering those sacred spaces, you've got parents that are reacting to that and making this really difficult decision, believing it's going to be short term, to send their kids to Miami. And incidentally, several thousand Pedro Pans also went to Spain. I mean, that's another story that needs to be written. The number, and we don't know how many. I've seen the estimates are as low as hundreds, maybe 1,000 to maybe 5,000 or 6,000 kids that went to Spain. So there's these different programs that parents are sending their kids not just to the United States but elsewhere. So this is what a visa waiver looks like. That Walsh was able to secure the authority to get these published, print these, sign these, and get these to parents. And of course, the whole counter-revolutionary network in Cuba was able to counterfeit these and counterfeit passports and send kids to the US. But this could be filled out, and you see the signature of Brian Walsh. And as long as a child had this, they could go. One of the other things I mentioned and I don't want to go too long, I'll be wrapping up here. In that introduction, that sort of came to me as I was doing more of this research that I found interesting, this kind of racialization of Cuban children included in the United States. You can see here a photo from, this is probably 1962, 1963, of a protest that was pretty common in South Florida and other communities, showing this kind of vitriol against Cubans. You see, we the people speak English, state county is not Cuba, speak English, one country, one flag, one language, stop the Cuban takeover. And so, Cubans at this time, who for the most part identified in Cuba as white, come to the United States and are sort of lose a whiteness that they had in Cuba, are now having to confront a new kind of racial space. Common are stories of apartment complex owners not renting apartments to Cubans, right? They become kind of a vilified community on the one hand, but also in African-American communities in South Florida, in Miami, Cubans are seen as a kind of antagonistic, not so much Cubans themselves, but how the federal government is responding to the Cuban refugee situation. So, you know, Miami in 1960, 1961 is in the throes of the civil rights movement, the desegregating schools, employment, opportunities that weren't there for Black Miamians before. And here come Cubans who are able, from middle and upper classes, who are able and willing to do jobs for less money and are sort of competing and pushing out many African-American workers. The other thing is that many Cubans, not all, but many, are able to receive federal entitlements, monthly, basically welfare checks, that are more than the average Black family was getting in Florida at that time. So you see, this is from the Black magazine Jet from 1963, where if you read this, you kind of see this sort of complaint that was often in the Black press, that the federal government, the United States, is giving more assistance to Cuban refugees than its own Black citizens. And even in one of these articles, the writer Riley said, what we should do as Black Floridians is go to Cuba, come back as refugees, and we'll get better, better financial assistance than we're getting now. Said it correctly. So what did this look like if you were ages 6 through 18? If you were ages 6 through 16 and you were a child, you could come to the US, and that was that. If you were 17 or 18, the US government wanted to vet you to make sure you weren't a spy. And the program ended for you when you turned 19. But there are many anecdotes that there were children as young as 2 or 3 years old that came, even though the stated acceptable age was ages 6 through 18. So this is Florida City. That was mainly for young boys and girls, a transitional shelter. This is St. Joseph's Home in Helena, Montana. So you may have started in a place like Florida City or Matecumbe in Miami, and then get flown to Helena. Play baseball. This is Monsignor Walsh talking to Cuban boys at San Rafael Hall in March of 1962. Here he is at the Cuban Boys Home, which was one of these group homes in Miami, transitional shelter in Miami. You can see that there were also Cubans of Chinese ancestry in these groups too. And there were Afro-Cuban children also, but the majority of these kids, like the refugee wave that they were part of, identified in Cuba as white. This is also Montana. These are older Cuban boys that would have been headed to Helena as well. You can see that they are being welcomed. I think these are representatives from Carroll College. This is San Antonio, Texas, at an airfield. These are all women that were sent to San Antonio. I was talking to John earlier. One of the groups of people I met in Miami called themselves the Muchachitas de Villa Maria, named for the orphanage, the convent where they were in San Antonio. This group of women, now in their 60s and 70s, met when they were, you know, preteens and teenagers in 1961, 1962, and they formed such a bond, these 35 women or so, that they just maintain those friendships through life, and they meet yearly. And I was able to go have a dinner with them where they came, and they just have these incredible stories. But clearly they have these bonds that are like familial, even stronger maybe than family bonds that happened in their case in San Antonio. These kind of reunions are very common around the country. This is Camp Matecumbe. One of the other things I found interesting in doing my research is there's kind of this regimentation that happens, right? It's not just to help Cuban children. It's not just to fight communism, but it's also to Americanize, right, the world's children, right, to sort of raise the world's children. And there's this kind of regimentation that happens where you read a lot of the kind of archival letters and memos that I read, and some of the complaints are these voluble, wild Cuban boys, right? That just they're unkempt and they can't be controlled. And so one of the things, particularly in the Catholic Church, that happens is this, regimentation process where, you wake up at a certain time, you go to mass, you eat at a certain time, your movements are controlled, where you go is controlled. And there is a lot of mention of fears around homosexuality in the record. You see, because who was talking to these kids? The Catholic clergy, but also lots of social workers. So social work is kind of a newish field that is being used by these new welfare Catholic, I'm sorry, not Catholic, but child welfare organizations. And so these kids are talking to priests, nuns, but also house mothers and fathers, as well as social workers, psychologists, right? As I mentioned before, the whole kind of apparatus of child welfare is changing in the 1950s and 1960s. And so these folks keep notes, and there is an inordinate number of references to fears around, what we would call today queer intimacy. And it's part of that regulation, right? Regulating, especially boys, to make sure they grow up to be proper American men, but also with women, girls who needed chaperones, whose movements were also controlled. And that is kind of this kind of interesting surveillance that happens. I feel this image really shows that, right? This kind of like almost quasi-military image. Foster families is the other thing. So you could be at a group home, but then you could go to foster families. And this happened for a lot of kids. If you wanted to, there was no adoption. That was not allowed, but you could foster kids. And what's also striking is, when I was in the National Archives, there are just boxes and boxes of letters from every state, organized by state, of people wanting to adopt Cuban children they had never met. From Somewheresville, Arizona, from Iowa, just, people, we are a good family. We have 2 children. We want to adopt one of these Cuban children and save them from communism. It's just extraordinary. Adoption was not an option. Parents still had rights over their children, but fostering did happen. And the way this would happen is often these families found out about these Cuban children in their churches. They were able to go to, in their state, set up a foster system, and then they were paid, right? And the Catholic Welfare Bureau paid these foster families, but then also filed for compensation with the US government. So you had the US government, you had the Florida state government, and you had these different welfare organizations, chief among them, the Catholic organization, the Catholic Welfare Bureau, that was shuffling the money, right? So that foster families could be paid, and then ultimately the Catholic Welfare Bureau could be reimbursed. And all of this, there was like a money trail, so all this could happen. This is a foster family of 2 Cubans of Chinese descent. Here are the Fong brothers, and this is in I think Whitefish, Montana. I'll just end with this, and then I want us to have a conversation. There's always lots of questions, but I'm interested to hear your experiences with these. So where are Pedro Pans today? Well, they are meeting and having all kinds of anniversaries and are a tight collective, but they're also being used politically in an interesting way, particularly in the state of Florida. You may know that Governor Ron DeSantis has sort of embraced the Republican position that migrants in general, children included, are another sign of yet a broken border and another sign that Joe Biden and the Democrats are failing to protect this country with a weak border. And so DeSantis, like some other governors, famously flew some migrants to, some northern, maybe Martha's Vineyard, and also closed a migrant children's facility that had been used incidentally by Pedro Pan's homestead in the early 1960s. So when he did that, there was a lot of opposition to that, but also from the Archdiocese of Miami. Thomas Welski, the Archbishop, wrote a pretty intense op-ed in which he said, this is cruel, that Florida shouldn't close the doors on migrant children. And the governor is wrong. And the Archbishop said, just look at how we opened our doors in the early 1960s to the Pedro Pans, right? So Ron DeSantis has to now, deal with that. And so what he does is he calls a press conference and invites Pedro Pans to the press conference, and these particular Pedro Pans become kind of spokespeople for why DeSantis is right. DeSantis and the Republicans are right, that these migrant children are not the same as Pedro Pans, right? The children coming from Honduras or Guatemala are not the same as the Cuban kids were. And it's divided within the Pedro Pan community. There's certainly Pedro Pans that distance themselves from the modern migrant children's phenomenon that we have today. But there's also Pedro Pans that say, no, I mean, this country helped us and we were afforded entitlements that, came from charity, and we need to do the same for these kids. So it just shows, I think as this idea of the political symbolism of Cuban children remains, even as these people are in their 60s and 70s, they are still sort of reliving these sort of moments of childhood. And, the trauma is still there. When I do people, I always ask, so I do a lot of archival research for this book, but I also just interviewed a lot of people. And one of the questions I ask everyone is, when did you begin to feel American? When did that American side begin to crystallize for you? And one guy I talked to, Mario Garcia, said it was, in 1963 when he was in math class, and the principal came over the intercom to let everyone know that John F. Kennedy had been assassinated. And Mario told me that the math teacher was an Irish Catholic woman, and she suddenly was beginning to fall. And instinctively, Mario must have been 13 or 14 years old. Instinctively, he got up to hold her, and they just embraced each other. And when he was telling me this story, this was a few years ago, he began to cry because it's obvious. And he, sort of tried to compose himself and said, he apologized. Said, I haven't thought about that moment, in 50 years. And there's something there are moments, it's part of their emotional scaffolding, right? That those moments of being 8, 9, 10, 11 are always with us, all of us, right? And what remains interesting and unique is that very difficulty to reconcile, on the one hand, feelings of abandonment, right? Parental abandonment. My parents put me on an airplane and I lost that parental contact when I was a child. I mean, it's a horrific thing to live through. But trying to reconcile those difficult feelings that remain with someone until old age with the kind of anti-communist heroism. My parents did the right thing. They made the ultimate sacrifice. And even today, as a 70-year-old, I am a living embodiment of that heroic journey, right? My life means something. So I will conclude there. And this is where you can find me. Just open this up to questions or comments.
Thank you for your presentation. Given such a large outflow of children from Cuba, why is it that in this country there are so many people, few people, that embrace communism and that way of life? Especially, I've heard in academia, there are some that embrace the life of Cuba and communism. I don't understand it. Maybe you could.
Are you saying Americans who find political value in Cuba and communism? Okay, so not these kids, because these people are not there. Yeah.
Here now, people that said it's a wonderful country,
Yeah.
Cuba, it's a great way of life. Maybe you could clarify
Well,
what you're thinking.
I mean, that's my first, I write about this in my first book. I think certainly that generation of people from the 1960s who were coming of political age on the left, like people in the university, 20, 21 years old, it's the 1960s. Cuba offered a kind of sort of an aspirational revolutionary program that made sense for 17, 18, 19, 20-year-olds, right, who were politically aligned a certain way. I mean, this was second wave feminism, this was the civil rights movement, this was the anti-war. And Cuba seemed to be this new society in the 1960s that was taking on racism, taking on imperialism, right? And that resonated with, people that we would call members of the new left. What I write about in my first book, though, is that there's a lot of disillusionment that happens from people who go to Cuba. People that, especially African Americans, who are going looking for this racial equality that the revolution is touting. The idea is socialism will solve racism, right? If you make everyone economically equal, racism will kind of go away. These things end up being mythical promises. There are a number of people that go to Cuba and are disillusioned. When you look at, for instance, how the revolution, detains homosexuals, that didn't resonate right for a lot on the left. But there are things, taking on at least the lip service paid to, thinking about womanhood and motherhood and taking care of the children and housing and things that the state was doing that wasn't in the United States that ended up being really, I think, attractive for a lot of young people. I don't sense today, but maybe I'm wrong, that there is the same glorification of Cuba. I mean, the reality is Cubans are leaving. There are more Cubans that have tried to get to the United States in the last year than the Mariel boat lift in 1980. I think the number is like 150,000 in the last year who are trying to come in. But the difference is that we don't have the same policy that we did. Right. Once we normalized or semi-normalized relations under Obama, we ended the wet foot, dry foot policy. So now coming from Cuba and getting into the United States is not as easy as it was before 2014. So I think those realities make it harder. But I do think there is, I've done this now for many years. And when I tell people I do research on Cuba, there is this, from an American perspective, this curiosity and people who say, I want to go, and see it and live it. There's something that is very exceptional in this connection. So yeah, I don't know. Does that answer your question?
Yes, it did. But a further question, it seems like in this country, there are certain areas progressives want to embrace socialism and want to have.
Do you mind using the mic?
Sure.
Yeah.
There are progressives in this country that feel that it's time to follow maybe in the footsteps of the Cuban Revolution, which was all somewhat about wealth redistribution. Let's make everyone equal. So right now we have political parties here in New York City that are pushing a narrative that we need to have an equal playing field and let's, tax everyone so that the poor people won't be left behind. It didn't work in Cuba, but right here, those parties are getting lots of votes. And who knows what could happen. I certainly don't approve of that. Maybe you do. I don't know.
I haven't had the sense that Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, for example, I haven't had the sense of someone like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez who might be in that camp is like embracing Cuba to do what she wants to do, right? This is a different generation. Even Bernie Sanders, who was, very much part of that 60s left, I don't think Ocasio-Cortez and young people who consider themselves democratic socialists are saying we need to do what Cuba did. I think it's moved beyond it, but that's my sense.
That's true, but they're kind of doing it. It's happening. A lot of the laws that are being passed are following in the Cuban socialism history. And I don't think it's a good road for this country.
Can I jump in here for a second? I appreciate the question. I think it's a It's a very complicated question. I'm wondering, I do want to get back to the Pedro Pan story. And I'm wondering if anybody has questions specifically about Pedro Pan or about John's research on the program. If not, yeah, please.
Thank you for your presentation today. I think you do a great job at being objective, but also, showing a lot of sensitivity, because I imagine must have been a really hard story to dig into. My question is if you can comment on the structures and sort of like the logistics of how the people in charge were making sure that the children remain connected with their parents, right? What they had planned and what happened.
It's a great question. What they had planned and what happened didn't always go together. Right. So children were able to write their parents. Okay, and that happened. In fact, lots of institutions encouraged writing. Some were able to make phone calls, but there was no confidence that A, those phone calls could even make it, and B, that those phone calls would be listened in on by Cuban authorities. So there was, they were kind of cut off, but there was communication enabled by phone calls sometimes and by letter writing. But it had to work through, at least this part of the story I'm telling, through Father Walsh's organization, right? And there were ways to, Cuban parents had to make their ways here. And when they got here, you went to Miami or you contacted Miami and said, where's my kid? And that's how it happened. People often didn't, you could meet with your parents in New Jersey, you could meet with your parents in Los Angeles, but that happened without any kind of firm timetable, right? Parents who were planning to go in 1961 couldn't go in 61, tried again in 62, couldn't go. And then, okay, now the Cuban Missile Crisis happened. I'm going to try in 1963. Now I have to go through Mexico. It was a very unpredictable sort of thing. And then when the freedom flights happened in 1965, you see an increase in those reunions. My sense is a lot of kids had family members. So that's the other part of this story. Many, not all, but many of these children are coming from middle class or well-to-do families who had family members or had history in the United States. So parents had connections here. One woman I interviewed, she was taken in by the neighbor of her, I think, grandmother who had lived in Cuba, who is now in the United States, right? So not even blood relatives, but someone who could sort of account for you. And there was a way to kind of do that. It wasn't always clear where children were. And some children left the program and then came back into the program when parents weren't, they thought they were, because it's a weird thing. You think, oh my gosh, the minute you, like as a parent, I would think the first thing I want to do is see my kid when I get to Miami or to the United States. But that reunion is much more difficult than I think we would expect it to be. There are stories, for example, from the Pedro Pans who said, when my parents showed up, we had an altered relationship. Now I was the caregiver because I knew English, and my parents, who had suffered more living longer in the revolution in Cuba, trying to get out, traumatized that they had sent me, they were the people that needed care. So now all of a sudden I was the parent. That parent-child relationship completely changed. And there was a sense from parents that, one interview, or not interview, but one anecdote I'd read, the parent said, I had the sense that I lost my kid twice, once in Cuba, and then once again when I came to the United States. I realized that this child was my child, but it wasn't the same. So that sort of relationship. So sometimes kids thought, and parents thought they could just get the apartment or a place to live and we'll be a family again. That didn't always happen. So there were cases when children were with their parents, but then parents needed more time to sort of set the life up. And so the kid came back under care, not very often, but sometimes that happened. Mm-hmm.
What was the length of time normally that the child was without the parents and the parents came?
It's a great question, and I don't know the answer to it. The number usually tossed around is 95% of children were rejoined with at least one parent. Okay, that sometimes happened, within weeks, months. It happens for one, a lot of this is the stuff I read. One guy didn't see his parent. One parent died in Cuba and then didn't see, I think, his mother for 21 years. So he became like an adult. But my sense is that most of the Pedro Pans, if we're talking about the 14 to 15,000 children just in the United States, saw at least one parent, I want to say, within 3 years, is my sense, but I don't have it. I think the Walsh's archive says something like 90% by 1966, I think is the number that's in my book. Yeah. But those reunions were not, you're just never the same, and that the family dynamic was just sort of forever altered. And you realize, this definitely plays into the politics of today, right? They are just, a community that, and there's a difference between the other thing I write about in my book is there's a difference between Pedro Pans in Miami and Pedro Pans that went other places. Just talking to some of my interviewees who went to Montana or who went to Virginia or who went to Iowa, they said, there's a way, like, I need the Miami Cubans. I need my fellow Pedro Pans, like that's my identity. But at the same time, we have different politics. And, when I was doing interviews during the Obama presidency, that's when a lot of these interviews took place. There were Pedro Pans that were pro-Obama who were sort of ostracized from, anti-Obama Cuban Americans in Miami. And that was like part of their reality as adults. Like, we are the same, but we're also not. So there's differences where, according to where people go, which is the Americanization process writ large, right? Do you go to a city? Do you go to a town? Are you in the North? Are you in the South? But it's interesting to see those kind of dynamics up close in a relatively controlled group.
But you're also dealing with adolescents. They're going from 11, 12 to 3 years later.
Yeah.
They're 16.
Mhm.
That's also an element. So
It absolutely is. It's a great point. It's very different leaving your parents when you're 16 than when you're 6. You have more emotional resources to cope on your own at 16. In fact, one of my interviewees, Raul Alvaro, who lives here in the city, said for him, he was 17 and, he was always going to leave Bayamo. He was kind of like, I was ready for an adventure. And for him, he weathered this okay, but he was older. It's very different when someone is 6 years old and remembers the doll that their parents gave them as they were saying goodbye. So Havana Airport has something called the pecera, which means fishbowl in English. And it's like a glass wall. And you sort of like leave the person you're dropping off, goes through, on the other side, and you sort of see each other. And it's not really a clear glass. So it's like this really Hitchcock-esque, like, so I chuckle, but it's not funny. The trauma a kid had to have gone through holding a doll, seeing like the disfigured parent through this translucent, but not transparent glass would have been just extraordinary. So anyway, say.
Now you just have to write the screenplay.
Well, I want someone to buy. This is the right city for it. I would love someone just to do that work and just buy the rights for it. Yeah.
I have a comment, like following up on the discussion, is there any critical discourse around? It's like an irony, right?
Yeah.
Because what they fear the most, which was the separation from the kids from the parents, they actually propitiated that.
Right.
And
right.
that didn't really happen in Cuba,
Mhm.
as far as I know, that they sent the children to Moscow.
Right.
So like this, I don't know, it seems very ironic that
It is.
because of this fear, they actually ended up doing the thing that they were fearing.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And that's when the program unravels, right? Things that seemed rational, right? And but I make this is an analogy that is not perfect, but I think of just in our own time, the pandemic. I was thinking March in 2020, people were like, this will be a couple of weeks, this will be easy, we'll be back in no time, whatever. And it's just like, 1 million people die in a couple of years in the United States, So, that sort of like things just happen out of our control. To kind of put it in a modern sensibility, I think about that. But that irony, absolutely, there are Pedro Pans that look at that. And actually, there's another irony that happens 30 years later with Elian Gonzalez. You might remember from 1999 that boy who was 6 years old who was found a lone survivor on a raft on, I think, Thanksgiving in 1999. And the fight, right, between Cuba and the United States over this child, right? And Bill Clinton and his attorney general from Dade County, originally Janet Reno, it turns out, basically side on the rights of the father in Cuba, saying that the boy belongs with the father. And the Miami Cuban community said, no way, let's keep this boy here. I think his grandmother were here or something. We're going to keep him here, and lobbying Congress to make a special bill to just grant alien like residency. And what was ironic about that moment is, in some ways, you have Pedro Pans among this community arguing for the dispossession of parental rights for the good of alien, right? Which is exactly what their parents were afraid of back in Cuba in the early 60s, right? Under the argument that America's better for the boy, but like ultimately you're making the argument that he should not be with his father, which is, from a Pedro Pan perspective is, another kind of irony.
I think that question, again, is also very complicated, right? Because I think for many Cubans on the island, the closing of institutions, for example, like parochial schools, was a way of the state inserting itself,
Absolutely.
right, into a decision about something very intimate like education. That being said, I mean, I think the irony does stand, right? They lost this this connection to their kids. I want to go ask you a research question. That is, number one, how did you get sort of interested in this particular topic? And then secondly, we were talking beforehand about the fact that there's been stuff written about Pedro Pan before, but a lot of it, as you said to me, is focused very much on the experience of these children, and for good reason.
Yeah.
But you went to the Florida State Archives. You found stuff about to Lydia's earlier question about the administrative structure of this, and I wonder what you found. What did it reveal about the politics of sort of childcare in America? Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, so I'd be happy to. So I got into this topic when I was in graduate school, and I was writing a dissertation on the American left, the gentleman's first question. And I found in my research this story of Pedro Pan, and I just got really interested in it. And I put it in my dissertation, but it didn't fit. I had one of those Frankenstein dissertations that was just like a mess, but it had a lot of interesting information. It just wasn't cohesive. And so I said, my second book is going to be this story. I just got consumed with this. And there is a lot, there's good literature, lots of anecdotes. I mean, Pedro Pans are part of for the most part, professional classes. They have a voice. They have an imprint, right? You can find information on them, even though it's striking how many people in this country still have never heard of this story, but they're out there and they're producing their memories. I found though that like a lot of the story sort of centered around a particular narrative. And one of the things I found interesting, and also in speaking of ironies, is that, in trying to, on the one hand, you have like Pedro Pans and the Cuban American community that are saying, we left a repressive, reductive communist country. And yet, on the other hand, there can be a tendency for a particular Cuban American line. And so I like a way to tell a history, a way to talk about the politics of Cuba and being Cuban American, and especially among the Pedro Pan community in Miami. There's a way to tell this story, right? And if you divert from the story too much, it's like you're doing it wrong. And so that same reductionism on a different ideological edge of the spectrum can happen in the United States, right? So I got to know, I mean, it's like you have to ingratiate yourself. I'm not Cuban. And I think that sometimes that helped me more than it hurt me, right? I was able to say, I'm coming from this outsider's perspective. I'm not Cuban, so I don't have a stake in this. My last name has enough vowels and it's long enough that maybe I'm Latino, but I'm not. I'm Norwegian Italian. But so I was able to talk to people and I think get confidence from people. And that's when I started talking to people who had different versions of this story, right? That there was physical abuse, there was sexual abuse, there was trauma that was not dealt with. There were ways to not be able to talk about that in the Cuban American Pedro Pan community because there is only a heroic way to tell this story. And so I got into those stories and I found evidence of it in the archive, right? I mentioned, the concern with sexuality And there are stories that Pedro Pans have of being abused in foster homes and abused in the Catholic system. And I wouldn't say that that's like by any means the majority of stories, but there are these things that where cracks appear. Monsignor Walsh's archive, it's interesting when you start reading it in a particular way, you see those cracks. There's very little obvious mention of this. Although there are Pedro Pans who have brought lawsuits against the Catholic Church, and even one Pedro Pan who levied a lawsuit against Monsignor Walsh personally. And this is public record, you can find this. But he does, the way that this material is sort of kept is that there are mentions of, sexuality and deviance and, raising proper kids. And I found that really interesting. And I also found this paper trail, that Washington, D.C., the Department of Housing, Education, and Welfare, under that sat the Children's Bureau and Social Security Administration. Okay, so money came from somewhere to fund the Cuban refugee program, and within that larger program, the unaccompanied Cuban children's program. So there was federal money going into the Cuban refugee situation, kids included. Florida bore a big responsibility in these refugees because the majority of these refugees were coming to Florida. So now Florida needs money to do all this, right? So Florida, there's state money, there's federal money, and then there's the Catholic Church and these other organizations. Another one I was mentioning earlier is the United Hebrew Immigration AIDS Association or Society, which was a Jewish organization that took in refugees, Cubans included. The Children's Bureau was a kind of mainly Protestant organization that brought in kids. So these different welfare organizations also kept accounting and were able to be compensated for the monies that they spend. And that could happen at the state level or it could happen at the federal level. So in Walsh's archive is just an incredible laundry list of receipts. I mean, just accounting, because it's federal money ultimately. I did the National Archives, which that's where, as I mentioned, saw just incredible volumes of letters from people writing housing, Education, and Welfare, the Children's Bureau, and even, some of the organizations in Florida wanting to adopt or foster a kid. A lot of this paperwork also circulates. So paperwork you find in the Florida State Archives, there are copies of those exact letters and receipts and, ledger lines in Washington, D.C., or in Monsignor Walsh's archive, which is at Barry University in Miami. So that was also interesting. Like all these places are talking to each other, and they're circulating this, which makes, there's so many versions of this story and so many people have so many different memories, but I found that the paperwork that I sort of laboriously went through made for a narrative that, that made sense to me and that hasn't been part of the public record. I also really got into just the history of the Catholic Church. There's a chapter in this about what I was speaking about earlier. And also just the history of Miami. I found Miami, just going to Miami on these research trips, I just really found Miami, the history of Miami, and particularly Miami as a civil rights city. When these Cubans are showing up as people that are in between this kind of whiteness and blackness as understood in the United States, made Miami a really interesting place to me. So although these Cuban children went everywhere, this story of Miami and the Catholic Church of Miami and the Miami civil rights movement. I interviewed for this book 2 African-American civil rights leaders who are now in their 70s, who were, in the 1960s, were in their early 20s, and they're talking about here's what was going down in Miami in the civil rights movement. Here's the demonstrations we were doing. Here's how Black people were treated, in Miami at that time. So those stories added kind of a vivid, alternate sort of angle of this story that I wasn't anticipating. I wasn't going to think about Cuban and Cuban children and the racial implications of that, but it kind of became that when I started thinking about Miami in the civil rights movement and what happens when these Cubans who have have whiteness back in Cuba suddenly are being told to go to the back of the bus, but going to the white schools,
We're at time. I don't know if there are any other questions. One final question from the audience. If not, Thank you all for coming. Thanks to
Thank you.
John for his wonderful presentation.
Thank you.
We'll be doing a lot more of these events over the course of the academic year. Follow us on social media to learn more about our work. Thanks to our staff
Thank you
for
very much.
remarkable work as always. Enjoy the rest of your evening, everyone.
Thank you all.